I'm going to talk about some of the trends that I see going on, and then I really want to open this up for questions and conversation, and it can be about this topic or about other things that you want to know about the Chronicle. Certainly what's important to us, and the whole reason we exist is for this very same reason that the foundation is doing this kind of an event. It's very, very hard for nonprofits to understand what everybody's doing and what the latest trends are and what's already happening in some place that somebody's already figured out something that you're really struggling with. And our goal is to try to help make that a little bit easier. But we need you to help us do that, so your ideas for what kinds of stories we can do, what kind of resources we can provide is always really helpful. And so that's one of the reasons I really love coming out and having a chance to talk to people. So please be willing to engage and ask lots of questions once we get to that stage. That will really help shape our coverage of what we do for you. One of the things we did a couple years ago was we created an actual innovation beat. Because one of the things that we realized at the Chronicle was that we were not actually covering that area and thinking about that, even though in some ways I think what excited us 25 years ago coming into this field to create a newspaper was this idea of innovation. That's what is exciting about what nonprofits do, but yet we never really had sort of a focus on looking at that. So we have a reporter who spends pretty much most of her time thinking about innovation. Her name's Nicole Wallace. You've probably seen her name on a number of the stories that are most interesting to you. And she has a blog that's called Mission Innovation, in which she's always looking for ways to really talk about this subject in a great way. So I think it's really timely that you're focusing on this as your conference topic, and we hope to try to really shed more light on it. Now, let's see if we can move this. It worked before. There we go. So one of the things that we've been looking at certainly is the way that collaboration and innovation work, particularly in hard times. And that's certainly what we've been in, and sadly what all of the projections suggest that we're going to be in for quite a while. And I'm sorry to say that the economic projections don't look very good. Certainly all of the things that we're reporting on suggest that it's going to be at least another 5 years of really pretty hard times in terms of raising money and doing things. So clearly we need to find ways to make that money go further. The Nonprofit Finance Fund just came out with a new report looking at how nonprofits are coping with these really tough times. And if you don't know the Nonprofit Finance Fund, I highly encourage you to go to their website. They've got lots of fabulous tools and case studies and all kinds of things that really can help you figure out what's going on and how to improve your organization, and especially what financial tools are available. They're very hands-on at helping you do that. And they're a nonprofit, so their goal is to help you do more of that. They like to look at what they call lifeline organizations, in particular, the organizations that are really serving essential needs. And they do a focus on this by doing a survey every year. And one of the things that they found that is really, I think, the most discouraging thing I've heard in a long time is that most groups are finding it even harder to meet all of the needs, even than it was during the depth of the recession, in part because the very neediest are still having so many struggles. One of the things you probably noticed on the front page of the issue that you all have in your bags is a story that we did about government financing, but we looked a lot at food banks. And one of the things that was really striking about the stories of all the food banks was just how much need was continuing to increase, because even as people were getting jobs, and I'm sure you're seeing this in your communities, people aren't getting great jobs. They're working 2 or 3 jobs. They still need the food bank for help. So some of these food banks have now been working so hard to be able to serve all the needy that they are not able to let people come as often. We wrote about one in Oregon where they had to limit the number of visits to just 6 times a year because they'd spent all their reserves 10 times over. They couldn't raise any more money. Government money was in short supply. It's really pretty rough. And so I think that one of the things we're going to have to remember is that while the politicians and everybody else are saying everything's getting better and the economy is getting better, it's not getting better for everybody, and particularly for a lot of nonprofit groups. As a result, that's why a lot of people are really finding ways to be able to collaborate. As you can see here, one of the things they found when they asked groups they found that 39% of groups said that one of their strategies was very much collaborating with other kinds of nonprofit organizations. And I'm curious how much in this room, because that's the focus of what we're talking about, how many of you are in any kind of collaboration with another organization? So that's a pretty high number. But does it surprise any of you that it's not a higher number? I think that was what was, the authors of this report thought it was great that 39% said yes. I think what was surprising to me was that it was only 39%. So I think part of the goal and part of what we want to learn from so that by the time you all gather next year, there are more collaborative efforts going on. One of the ways that nonprofits are certainly looking at collaboration, and I'm sure you heard this yesterday in the presentation, is that now I think people are really looking at ways that leadership is changing, that it's important not to just be a founder who has the ego and thinks that you have all the solutions. That used to be the model, and certainly all the nonprofits that were created in the 60s and 70s in this great wave of nonprofit creation were created by very passionate people who had a wonderful idea and incredible drive, but they often thought that they could do it on their own, and that was part of what they got lauded for and praised for and how you rose up the ranks in the nonprofit world. I think people are really defining that in a different way and looking for people who know how to reach out, build alliances, and that kind of skill is incredibly important. One of the things that's interesting is I think it may be a little bit generational, and certainly that the very youngest people are extremely interested in thinking in coalitions, in networks. They grew up, obviously, in a completely networked world in terms of technology, and they think about that same thing in the way that they approach organizations. And there was a wonderful story I don't know if many of you read a blog that's called Fixes that the New York Times runs. If you don't, I really recommend it. It's got wonderful examples of innovation all the time, and they specifically look for these kinds of things. And about every 2 weeks, they feature something. And right after the Boston Marathon bombing, they felt a need to rush in a story that they hadn't really been planning on running, but they knew that everyone needed a little bit of uplift at this particular time because things were so difficult to think about what had happened there. And they looked at a group that's doing a Peacemakers Prize, and they're giving it to kids who are as young as 9 years old, working sort of 9 to 22. And there were these amazing stories about what these young people were doing. Almost all of them involved some kind of collaboration. They just naturally did that. That's what they were thinking about. That's the way they were engaged in it. There's going to be a bunch of prizes given out in October to honor the people who are doing those kinds of things. But I think we're going to really see that among the new leaders coming up, and it's really happening at these kinds of ages. We also see a lot of peer networks sprouting up in communities around the country. And we did a story on some of these about a year ago, and if you need a copy of that or anything else that I talk about in this presentation, feel free to drop me an email and I'll be happy to provide some of those things. One of the things that's very challenging about heading a nonprofit, and I'm sure many of you feel this way, is just how lonely it is and how you don't have enough people who you really can talk to about the kinds of problems you have. And one of the things you don't want to do often is talk about them publicly because you have to be the public face. You don't want people to know sort of what the challenges are inside the organization, but you really need to be able to talk about them. So what a lot of groups are doing is creating sort of safe spaces where it's easy for people to get together maybe once a month, beyond that, to really talk about what are the challenges of leading a nonprofit organization. Not surprisingly, it's helping in dealing with the challenges, but it's also building ties in communities, people who didn't know each other, even though they may be working on the same problems, or at least had ways of knowing each other. So I think we're starting to see that. A lot of nonprofits are also making that part of their mission in building entrepreneurial skills. There's a fast-growing group called A Million Cups of Coffee, A Million Cups, with the idea that actually they bring together people who will basically just have a cup of coffee together to talk about their entrepreneurial ideas. And one of the things that they realized was sometimes that simple effort of bringing people together is what is transformative. They didn't need this fancy program with lots of infrastructure, all those kinds of things, but they needed to find a way to get people together to talk about their ideas. And it's growing really fast and doing some amazing things. So I think you can apply some of those ideas in a terrific way. Another thing we see happening in a lot of nonprofits is hiring innovation officers or creating teams of people who are working on innovation. Some of that can be also very informal, where there are groups of employees who focus on innovation. Maybe they meet once a month, they ask people to come in and present their ideas for new ways of doing things. Sometimes they have a little pot of money that they're able to give out, and we're usually talking about really small sums of money. It doesn't take a lot sometimes to get some of these innovative ideas going. And oftentimes when it is a group of the employees getting together and talking about this, not surprisingly, it works a little bit better than when a CEO comes in and imposes it from the top. There's a lot of debate about whether innovation officers are a necessary thing. One very well-respected nonprofit leader, Daryl Hammond, who you may know, who runs Kaboom, said that he really thinks that's a bad idea. And he's got one of the most innovative nonprofits I think there is in the country, because he said he wants everybody in his organization to be thinking about innovation and to doing it all the time, and he doesn't want to delegate that. But other organizations that have made this work said, wait a minute, we have people doing 10 zillion jobs. Every single person is doing too many things. We'll never get some of these new ideas out unless we give people specific responsibility for doing what is the most innovative thing we can possibly think of. So there's a range of views. Fortunately, more people have been trying this, so at least we're getting to the point where it's possible to evaluate whether it really works for nonprofits, and you have more information to think about this kind of thing. Another thing we see a lot of is community collaboration. And last year, the White House issued a report to study what's going on in communities themselves. And part of the idea is to say, in philanthropy, there's always this desire to just bring in good ideas from the outside. They work someplace else. Let's just bring them into a community and make sure that they grow. Well, oftentimes those don't work very well because they're not really very relatable to that particular community. And a good idea that works one place doesn't necessarily work so well anyplace else. So instead, what this report was looking at is what happens when the United Way, the Community Foundation, the local businesses, everybody else gets together and says, let's fight a problem like teenage pregnancy, and let's really deal with it together. And they found that as many as 500 efforts were going on around the country to do this sort of thing. So there's lots of interest, and many of them are making a very big difference. One of the interesting ones to look at as a model, if you don't know it, is Strive Partnership, which works on education. It was born in Ohio by a very young nonprofit leader who was honored last year with Independent Sector's Award for Next Generation Leaders. And now the idea is spreading to other places. They're trying to create this idea of really building a local leadership core in other cities. And it's a very interesting model that really has made it much of a difference. One of the things that was striking in the report that was done by the Bridgespan Group was that even though they had found all of these efforts, and there were loads of things going on and they were very excited about that, it's really hard long-term work. Very few of these groups had really managed to meet all of the changes that they had wanted to meet within the first 5 years of their operation. They really need to be able to look at the long term. There needs to be patience. And I think one of the things that sort of the White House was saying by issuing this report was saying, this is important, this matters a lot, but we have to stick with it. Don't expect that everybody is having these miraculous results overnight. Another thing we're certainly seeing is that innovation requires data. You can't know what kind of a difference you're making unless you start measuring it. And I think every nonprofit leader knows that there are a lot of things that seem like they're really good ideas, and then when you measure them, you find out that honestly, it really isn't improving the lives of people as much as you thought it was. And it's a harsh reality, but it turns out to be true. But finding out what's working and what's not by looking at the data often can really show you what are the ways to make a difference. In the issue that you have in your packets, there's a profile of First Place for Youth, which is a really interesting organization that it started off to provide housing to kids who were in foster care. And that was its mission. And it didn't really think it was making enough of a difference in the lives of really troubled kids. So it realized that really what it cared about was being able to help kids live in a self-sufficient way. So as it redefined its mission, it realized how could it figure out whether it was doing very well at helping these young people who were starting to age out of foster care. What could it do to make a real difference in knowing that kids would be self-sufficient? So it imposed all kinds of measurement techniques. So throughout the year, caseworkers are constantly measuring what's going on, finding out what's happening, monitoring what's going on. And it helped pinpoint a lot of things that were going wrong in the way that the organization was working, a lot that was going right. But certainly they kept learning things that helped them improve the program. And they did it because they wanted to improve the program. But the wonderful thing is that since donors are all obsessed right now about results and measurement and techniques, they were able to grow from being a $2 million organization to an $11 million organization, because every donor is just dropping all over themselves to be able to say, you've got results, you can measure them, you can show them, that's what I want to pay for. So they're growing and growing and growing. And it really shows what, even though it can be awfully burdensome to start putting in a data system, as a matter of fact, this group had 40% turnover when they first put in the data system, because people really did not like being expected to do this, and their pay was tied to some of these performance measures, and people didn't like that. It was a different system. And one of the things that the group's founder is quick to recognizes that he made a mistake in not really getting the employees much more involved in shaping the measures and talking about it and explaining how it was going to go. And so they completely revised how they imposed this whole measurement system. So there are risks to doing all of it, but in the end it has paid off, and the kids are doing much, much better in this program, and they're really getting fabulous results, which is, after all, what we all care about. As I've noted here, we've got a bunch of resources on how you can get data and other models of what various groups are doing, and it's available on our website at philanthropy.com. There we go. Another thing a lot of groups are doing is certainly harnessing technology in different kinds of ways. And certainly we see lots of things that are being created, nonprofits that start off just by being very different in the way they use technology. But what's exciting to see now is the way that technology is helping pretty old-style organizations improve what they're doing. A very neat group called Benevolent. Do any of you know it? It just got a big grant from the Knight Foundation. After struggling for years and years, because one social worker was just determined that she was going to make a difference and change people's lives, because she saw what the problem was. Often for people in pretty difficult circumstances, it isn't 10 zillion things that they need. Sometimes it's just that their refrigerator broke down, and that's keeping them from feeding their children well and doing things. Sometimes it's that their car broke down and therefore they can't get to work. Sometimes if they just had somebody to help them pay those bills, that would make a giant difference in many other parts of their lives. It won't solve all their problems, but she realized that some of those little obstacles that you could raise money for and pay for without raising million-dollar grants, it was possible to transform people's lives. She was determined. She kept working at it in many different ways, and she couldn't figure out a way, though, to connect donors with the real people. So she borrowed the model that Kiva uses of reaching out to the crowd, and decided that she was going to find a way to use technology to let people know, connect donors directly with the recipients. But what's interesting about the model is, and what doesn't happen in some of these new uses of technology, is there's a lot of vetting that goes on. She works directly with the social service organizations to make sure that the money is used the right way, and that once people get the kind of help that they need, that then they're connected with other community services. So it's taking an idea that it has a lot of the things that really work well about most social service organizations, but giving it a way to reach out to donors where they are now, which is they're online, they want to give one-to-one. That's one of the powers of the Kiva model, is people want to say, I am helping this particular person do better. And they're not necessarily going to give to an appeal for Catholic charities, but they're going to give to something that helps a person who looks like my neighbor or somebody that I know that I want to help. And so it's a really interesting way of taking that approach, taking a bunch of old ideas, but putting it in a new way and using it very differently. We're also seeing a lot of innovation in finance, and your earlier panel was talking a lot about these low-profit corporations, these B corporations, other kinds of ways of thinking about financing nonprofits. And I think we're seeing certainly a lot of growth in that. One of the more interesting things that's going on is something called pay-for-success bonds, which you may have seen a lot of talk about. Certainly governments of all kinds are thinking about this because it's a new way of financing both what government used to finance and getting nonprofits and donors involved in the process. So the idea is that a group of donors come up front with the money to do a program that's going to solve a problem. Let's say trying to keep people from going back to jail. So they put, and this is an idea that's being tried in the UK, as some people may know. There's been a pretty long-term experiment there going on with that. Everybody agrees what kind of results need to be achieved by what periods of time. when you get to that point, let's say 5 years, and they measure what's happened, has this program actually made a difference, or has it not changed anything at all? If it has actually made a difference, then government says, okay, that's great, we want to pay for this program. They're going to pay the investors back, possibly with some interest. If the program 10 years from now is getting even better results, then there might be even more of a financial return for the investors. If the program tanks and doesn't work and is just a good idea that people tried but turned out not to be the right kind of thing, then it just becomes what the donors would probably have done anyway. It's a charitable gift, and that's fine. That's what they meant to do. So it's turning on its head the idea of who pays for things, who gets a benefit, and what the goal of it ultimately is to save society money in the long term, to really work at things that prevent problems, and to look at the fact that government can't just keep paying for things that aren't working, but trying to look at what actually makes a difference. And I think we're going to see a lot more in these very tight budget times of government really doing what donors in the private sector have been doing for a long time, which is looking at what makes a difference, what has impact, not just giving money to programs that they're not sure of, but that seem to be feel-good kinds of programs. Another thing we see in terms of innovation is people trying to realize that getting talent is really tough, and sometimes you have to grow your own. And I think one of the hardest things for nonprofits these days is being able to find good fundraisers. We've been doing report after report, if you read the Chronicle, that shows how high fundraiser turnover is, in part because fundraisers are in demand and you can always get a better paying job by moving to another organization. And in part it's because some executive directors aren't very good at working with their fundraiser and don't understand what it is that a fundraiser does. So you see all kinds of frustrations that are leading to this incredible churn in the fundraising world. So an organization named Zoomix, which provides music to kids in Boston, decided there's no way it could afford a development officer to do all the kinds of things that it needed to do. So it hired a Vista volunteer who had been organizing some events for them and said, we can't pay you very much. We're not going to be able to pay you very much, but we're going to invest everything we can in your professional development, and hopefully as you get better at doing what you're doing, you will help us grow, and together we will be able to grow. It's been working very, very well. And one of the things that this group learned from doing this is that it is now giving that same kind of investment in professional development and education to everybody on the staff. And this is a tiny group. It doesn't have very much money. But it realized that the best way to keep staff engaged and doing the right things is to invest in their professional development. And it's working to really be able to do that. And I think that's one of the things that too often we don't think about in the nonprofit world, is the fact that we need to keep people. It's not just enough to have passion for the mission. That's clearly what motivates all of us to do the things that we do. But we really need to find ways to help people get the skills they need to grow and to stay with the same organization rather than turning over and thinking about going to another place. I've been talking a lot about what nonprofits are doing to collaborate and innovate. And one of the things that is interesting is how much innovation and collaboration is actually going in among donors. And I know one of the constant concerns that nonprofits have when foundations ask them to collaborate is, well, why don't you all collaborate? Because it doesn't always seem that foundations do that. But there's actually a lot going on, and I was a little surprised when I was pulling together some examples to come talk to you to realize just how much of that was happening. There's a group of donors who are getting together through the Draper Richard Kaplan Foundation. They're the ones that gave the money first to groups like Kiva, Room to Read, some of these really fast-growing groups that have just done phenomenally. It was founded by a group of donors who were in the venture capital business, and they applied some of the same ideas about how they looked for businesses that were going to grow. They've applied it to finding nonprofits that are poised to really grow in spectacular ways. And a lot of donors have found out about them and decided, instead of trying to do it on my own, I'm going to give through this organization that's already figured out how to identify talent. And so they opened up a pooled fund for donors to be able to participate in, and they got so many donors to wanted to be able to give their money in this kind of way that they had to do a second round of financing. Now, you don't hear that very often, donors dying to come together in some kind of way and give up their money. But the donors got so excited by this model and saw so many results and realized, which is also a big thing, that they did not have the skills themselves. And it's hard for donors sometimes to step aside and realize that they don't know everything there is to know about how a nonprofit works. And these groups are really working together in a pretty exciting kind of way. So hopefully we'll be seeing more of that in the nonprofit world. George Soros just announced a competition a couple weeks ago called the Open Places Initiative that's working in cities around the country to be able to encourage collaboration to solve problems. And they made very clear when they made the grants announcement that they were only going to give it to groups that already had a collaboration in place. And some of the work that they're doing is modeled on, some of you may know in Baltimore, they've been doing some really outstanding things that George Soros has been financing for a long time to really work on. Baltimore has a lot of problems and really trying to deal with some of the grittiest ones of them. And they realized that one of the secrets to what was working was that the groups that were involved in collaborations were doing the best. So now they're trying to finance this model. What's important about this isn't just that there's that pot of money available, but clearly a lot of other donors follow what George Soros does in all kinds of ways. And so I think that the fact that they're emphasizing collaboration in the grant making means that we'll see a lot more of that in other places. The Boston Foundation just announced the winners of 2 groups in its Boston Collaborates, and they give an award, $50,000 apiece, to groups that are trying to improve the lives of young black men and work in a collaborative way. And they found 2 groups that are doing very cool things, largely to train young people to be involved in science, math, robotics, those kinds of things. And they're really thinking about ways to train young people for the jobs that do exist in the future. But instead of just saying, okay, here are our 2 winners, they've posted on their website the names of all of the groups that had applied. There were 70 groups that were in competition for this award, and their hope is, and certainly as a community foundation they have the power to do that, is to attract other donors to say, these are groups that are worthy of investing. We didn't have the money ourselves to be able to do it all, but here are some terrific examples of collaboration that's going on. So I think we're starting to see more highlighting of that by community foundations, bringing other donors into this mix. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is taking a pretty different approach to thinking about collaboration, and they do a lot of innovation as well that's worth looking at, but I'm going to talk about their collaboration today. They're trying to promote a model that's called collaborative learning, and it came out of an idea. As you know, lots of foundations have been encouraging nonprofits to merge in this difficult economic climate, and we don't see a lot of mergers, and you're going to notice in my examples today, this is the only time I'm going to talk about mergers deliberately, because we've not seen much of that. We've seen collaboration. We haven't seen organizations really in a big way coming together and merging, because merging is difficult. It has a lot of costs. It takes a long time for it to happen. And while I think a lot of foundations thought that that was the magic answer when the recession happened, is let's just have everybody merge, it wasn't really the great solution. So one of the things that Robert Wood Johnson did was it tried to encourage a merger between 2 groups that were working on getting cars to low-income people so that they could drive to their jobs. The 2 groups had radically different approaches to both how they raised money, how they helped people, what they did, but the goal was the exact same thing, is to get transportation so that people could get to their jobs. And the groups talked for a long time, and they realized there was no way there was going to be a merger. This was not going to happen. It wasn't in either of their interests, and they couldn't see it happening. But as they were talking, one of the things they realized was they were learning a heck of a lot from each other about what worked about their models and different ways that things could happen. And they realized what they needed was some kind of facilitator to come in and decide what kind of information was the right kind of information to share, because they were also competitors. And because we have that so often in the nonprofit world, where people are working on the same mission and the same thing, but they are also competing for the same donations, there isn't often a willingness to share information so much. So they brought in a mediator who helped figure out, how do we share this information with non-disclosure in a kind of way that's really going to work? And it has made both programs lots stronger. And Robert Wood Johnson was so excited about this that there's a case study. It's about 30 pages that explains a whole process of how they went through this collaborative learning idea. And one of the things that they're really trying to spread is there are ways that you can work together. There are ways to avoid some of the mistakes that happen in working together. And this lays it out so that you don't have to make any of those mistakes yourself. Another thing we certainly see in the world of innovation, there's a lot of talk about impact investing. And that's another innovation that a lot of donors are trying. And mostly what it means is that they're not looking just at grants anymore. They're looking at what goes on with the rest of their portfolio. Foundations are required to give 5% of their money away every year. What happens to that other 95%? Is it invested in anything that's actually making a difference? And foundations have been sort of gingerly going into this area for a while, but the Heron Foundation has put its entire portfolio into efforts that are creating jobs. It realized that the only thing, its mission is about improving the economy and improving economic independence, fighting poverty, and it has decided that creating jobs is really the only thing that's going to make a difference in really changing this particular juncture that we're in. So they are looking at every investment they make, be it a grant, be it their stock portfolio, what does it do to create more jobs? They also look at things like, is it also environmentally friendly, and the kinds of things that you might think, that social screens were important, but all of it has, the bottom line is, what does it do to create more jobs and to think about things in that way? So I think we may, every foundation is watching what the outcome of this one is. There are some concerns about, could they lose their entire portfolio doing some of this if they make some bad bets? Doing that most foundations are pretty conservative usually in the way they make investments, but they're pretty determined that they're going to make a difference, and you'll be reading about this more in the issue that arrives when some of you get home. We did a feature on what they're doing. Another thing we're seeing is crowdsourcing by donors, and a really remarkable thing happened about a year ago when I opened my Washington Post in the morning and saw a call from a billionaire for ideas on how he should give his money away. You don't see that very often, not with people who have billions of dollars to give away. But he wanted to know what kinds of ideas could he get. He wanted to fight poverty, and he had all this money, and he didn't know what to do with it. So he asked for ideas, and he asked for those ideas through this article in the Washington Post. Not surprisingly, he got many, many, many ideas. So much so that he completely sort of shut down and then wouldn't talk to anybody for a while because he realized that talking to people had got him inundated with all of these amazing ideas. But he winnowed them down and came up with a bunch of different grants that are now going, and now he's in this next phase. But the idea that some wealthy donors are actually thinking about asking the public for some of these ideas, you were talking in the earlier session about prizes and competitions, I think we're seeing more of that, reaching out instead of saying, I have this idea, I know all the answers, I'm going to figure it out. We're starting to see donors really finding ways to look out. And so hopefully in your communities you can encourage affluent people to turn to that model and find ways to say, what is it that we can do? Another innovation is a group called Greenlight that's working in Boston and now moving to other cities. And one of the things that they're doing is trying to bring the absolute best working programs to the cities where they're operating, a city like Boston. So instead of creating their own programs, they're saying, look, there's got to be a great program that's gotten wonderful results on how to do something like fight drug abuse. Let's just bring it in and bring a model here, and we're going to go around the country and look at all of these best ideas and bring them into our community. And it's a group of donors who have gotten together to talk about how the best way to do that is, and they're financing this whole thing of moving various groups and looking for the best ideas out there around the country. So it'll be interesting to see when they have a consolidation of all of these different groups, whether that really makes a difference. I want to talk a little bit as much about not just what is going on, but what we don't need so much in the nonprofit world when we talk about innovation and collaboration. And the key thing is certainly we already know a lot about what does work. We just don't often get the money or the collaboration needed to actually pull it off. So I think one of the things that a lot of people who have been working in philanthropy for a long time are pretty worried about is this idea that people can just wrap up an idea that sounds innovative but really isn't, really doesn't get results, and make it seem like it's a great new thing, and that we're getting a little bit too enticed by that. And so we have to watch out, make sure we ask questions about what really is new and different. One of the things about the Social Innovation Fund, which is a White House effort to spread great programs, is that it actually isn't about innovation. And while it uses that in its name, I think it uses that to be able to get public attention to it. But what it really is about focusing on programs that are getting results already and saying, how do we spread them and how do we make sure that they make a difference and how do we measure that they're making a difference? So what the innovation was is to say we're actually going to be accountable and we're going to measure these results. And you know, I think it's an interesting way for government to start influencing those kinds of things, but to say some of the greatest ideas just need to be spread more. One of the things that's gotten a lot of traction certainly is the idea of spreading something like Harlem Children's Zone to more communities, and certainly there's been a lot of federal money going into that idea to say we've already solved some of these problems. We know what works, we just need to do it, and we need to get the money together to be able to do it. The other part about knowing what already works is to recognize that philanthropy takes a lot of time and takes a lot of patience. And some of the kinds of problems that you're all trying to solve are not going to be, we're going to make progress, but they're not going to be solved for quite a long time. And we need donors to be able to be willing to put in that time and not say, we need to get results in the next quarter, in the next year. That's the difference between philanthropy and business, is that it should be focused on the long term. But I think over the past few years with all of the importing of business ideas, which has been very helpful to the nonprofit world, we've also gotten a lack of patience. And one of the things that we need is to realize that a little bit of patience would be a good idea, because otherwise we're never going to invest in some of these programs that actually do make a difference. The other thing that we don't need is to stop risking and to stop failing. And failing is hard, but it's important. And one of the things that a lot of nonprofits are trying to encourage talk about now is what goes wrong, because we all know that if we're really risking, things are going to go wrong. That means that there's failure. And some of that is changing the incentives of how things work so that it's okay to fail and that failure is a good thing. The Case Foundation, which is the foundation founded by Steve Case, the AOL founder, has a campaign that it's called Be Fearless. And it's really trying to encourage both nonprofits and donors. It's got lots of great things on its website that are very helpful to talk more often about what goes wrong so that, first of all, other people don't try what goes wrong, but also to realize that that is very much part of the innovation process. There are a number of efforts around the country called fail fairs, where people get up and talk about things that they've tried that didn't work. Often they're held in the evening. Often they require a little bit of wine before people talk about what's really failing. But people have been very open about what they're doing and learned from it. And it's spreading as an idea of a way to gather people together and to say, it's all right, we're going to talk about it. Some people are still not comfortable talking about that publicly, which is what these fail fairs are, so they're having internal versions of it. And so a lot of nonprofits will, at a meeting, a staff meeting or a staff retreat, have a session that really encourages people to talk about failure. At the Hewlett Foundation, the president offers lunch to the program officer who has the best failure. And you know, because in both foundations and nonprofits, there aren't those incentives. We all want to do the right thing, and we're all trying really hard to do it. But it's, you know, it's really in part breaking down these cultural barriers. Engineers Without Borders issues a failure report to its donors. Now, they're engineers, so they know about failure and they know how to fix things, and so maybe they're more comfortable with that than other people are. But they've got tremendous response from their donors because they realize that this was a breath of honesty that they don't often hear from nonprofits about what the challenges are and what we need to learn from each time we fail, about why we need to do things differently and why we might need some investments to do things in a different kind of way. So some of this openness about talking about failing, understanding that that is part of innovation, is very critical. So while I want you to all succeed, I also hope you'll all talk a lot more about failure as well. I would love to make sure that the Chronicle helps you get all the resources you can. Our website is philanthropy.com. We have a daily free email, Philanthropy Today, that keeps you up to date on the news of what's going on in the nonprofit world, plus everything we've posted online. We do free live chats every Tuesday that allows you to pose your questions directly to experts about any topic you want. There's an archive online of all of our previous chats so that you can go back and find all the experts that you want. But it's really nice to participate live because you really get to be able to ask whatever question you want to amazing people. Next week, those of you who are fans of the NPR show program, Wait, Don't Tell Me, Peter Sagal is going to be on to talk about how to make things fun when you're talking about really grim subjects, which is or if you're talking about happy subjects, but you want to find ways to make people engaged in your mission. And as a public radio host, not just of a program that's entertaining to listen to, but certainly in public radio, they need to raise a lot of money. They need to make it interesting. They need to find ways to do it. And he's going to talk about some of the things that succeed. So I think it's going to be a pretty good chat, and I hope you'll join us for that. We also do webinars that can help you learn various things about fundraising, social media, and we have lots of data that will help you be able to benchmark your own programs and find out what's going on. And I hope you'll take a look at the kinds of things that can help you. If you can't figure out where to find what you need, just send me an email. I'm editor@philanthropy.com.